As the final seconds waned at the end of Super Bowl 45, the Green Bay Packers went on to win their first championship since 1996 by winning the Super Bowl for the 2010 season. This would go on to be the final game to introduce us to a generational year in the history of sports for the following year. All-time athletes and teams would go on to shine for the following year in 2011 in such a competitive year for the entire sporting world. 2011 would go on to be a generational year in the world of sports for virtually every team, especially those who had a lot of history and athletes that were extremely iconic. The following year in football, Eli Manning took the New York Giants to a 9-7 record, but was able to light it up in the playoffs and make it to Super Bowl 46 and beat the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl for the second time in 4 seasons. I hate talking about these Giants Super Bowls. In baseball, the Texas Rangers made it to the World Series for the second year in a row and looked like the favored team to win it after dominating it for most of the series. But the St. Louis Cardinals stayed alongside them, and the Rangers on 2 separate occasions in Game 6 were 1 strike away from winning their first World Series championship. Unfortunately, they never were able to get that final strike, and in the elusive Game 7 that everyone loves talking about, and just Game 7 in general, the St. Louis Cardinals went on to win the series as a huge underdog for their first series championship since 2006. In the NBA, Clash of Titans ensued, with LeBron James and the Big Three in the Miami Heat going all the way to the NBA Finals, while the Dallas Mavericks went to go face them in a rematch of teams of the 2006 Finals, where the Mavericks were able to best the Heat in 6 games that year. In the NHL, the Boston Bruins went all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals and won their first championship since 1972, defeating the Vancouver Canucks in 7 games. In the world of American motorsports, especially NASCAR, which was still at a pretty high rating back then, we had an all-time classic season that saw Carl Edwards dominate the year with 25 plus top 10s, but only 1 win coming early on in the year at Las Vegas, while Tony Stewart, a 2-time champion, barely made the playoffs and won 5 of the final 10 races to go on to win at Homestead and tie Edwards in points at the end of the year, but due to having more wins, 5 to Edwards' 1, he was declared the champion on virtue of the tiebreaker. The New York Giants had been around since 1925, virtually the entire time the NFL has existed as an organization. The St. Louis Cardinals have been around since 1893, virtually the entire time the MLB has been an organization, and they were the second winningest team in championships, only behind the New York Yankees, as the Cardinals have 11 to the Yankees 27. The Boston Bruins were one of the NHL's original 6 teams for 25 years, and even though the Dallas Mavericks came around in 1980, they still watched the evolution of basketball from the 80s all the way to now. And by virtue of Tony Stewart winning his 3rd premier NASCAR auto racing championship after being there for over a generation, it proved that the old guard, those athletes and teams and organizations that have watched their respective sport evolve across multiple years and generations, that they would sweep the US sports world for the entire 2011 season. There is still one division I haven't talked about, however, for the 2011 season, and that is football at the collegiate level. College football is different from the NFL because it has sort of a more sentimental value toward people, but that's for multiple different reasons. I'm not going to get into it. But did the old guard go strong there? Well, in college football, it's been around for a really, really long time, and there are just a few select teams that are known for basically being successful organizations for college football every single year that they play in the league, teams like Alabama and Michigan. But we're going to look at one specific team from that old guard group that did not perform up to expectations in the 2011 season. That year where the old guard proved strong across all of sports, this was the only old guard team, or the most prolific old guard team, to have a struggling year in that old guard season in 2011. This is the worst season in Ohio State Buckeyes football history. At the conclusion of the 2010 season, Auburn was able to beat my Oregon Ducks to win their first national championship since 1957. No, I do not think any of these are national championships in between 57 and 2010. However, Ohio State was not battling for the national championship in 2010, as although they had an amazing season going 12-1, they had the whole football scandal that happened that year, dealing with NIL and other things and drug trafficking and a lot of other random weird scandals going on that even got the FBI and the US Department of Justice involved. The NCAA ended up forcing Ohio State to vacate all 12 wins they had that year. So officially, according to all NCAA record books, the 2010 Buckeyes are recorded as having finished the year 0-1, with the only game that didn't vacate was the loss they had to Wisconsin. They were the best team in the Big Ten that year, and basically, since that whole scandal happened, it pretty much marred their entire team heading into the 2011 season. Head coach Jim Tressel in his 10th season was humiliated and would resign as head coach following that year. And really, their team as a whole, if you look at it, there's not many household names. They had some decent stats on both offense and defense, with their main guy in this recruiting class being Cameron Hayward, who would go on to get drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers the following year, meaning that the 2011 Buckeyes really needed to improve so that they could show everybody that they weren't cheating because of NIL deals and stuff. They needed to get back to their usual form at the top of the college football world, as they were still looking for their first national championship since 2002. As the investigations from the scandals went on just before the start of the 2011 season, it was announced that the NCAA would punish the Buckeyes organization not only by vacating all their wins from the 2010 season, as I said before, including their Sugar Bowl win, but they would also be banned from playing in the postseason in 2012. They would be under probation for 2 years and a reduction of 5 scholarships over 3 years. In the first two games, the Buckeyes were able to dispose of Akron easily and were able to stave off Toledo to climb to number 15 in the polls. But the following week is where we would see Ohio State start to struggle against the Miami Hurricanes, where they would fall to 17th in the polls with a dismal game, losing 24-6. Quarterback Joe Boserman went 2 for 14 with a 14.3 percentage of completion, pass completion percentage, for 13 total yards. And then backup Braxton Miller went 2 for 4 for 22 yards and an interception. That is pretty abysmal. The team had a grand total of around 150 yards on the ground, but they couldn't get the ball receiving anywhere, as they weren't able to even get 50 passing yards. After this loss against Miami, Ohio State would fall outside the top 25 in the polls, and the team would bench Boserman and put Miller as the starting QB, starting in the following game at Colorado, where they would dispose of them 37-17. But heading into their first conference game against Michigan State, the team would struggle mightily, barely getting over 100 passing yards, and allowing Michigan State, that had Le'Veon Bell and Kirk Cousins, to be on the good side of this ugly game that saw Michigan State win 10-7. But Michigan State sacked the quarterbacks 9 total times, including multiple tackles for loss and an interception. Although Ohio State had 2 interceptions to fight them right back, still Miller had his interception. And Boserman, although he threw a touchdown, it was an abysmal game that they lost 10-7. That put him at a lower chance of potentially getting back inside the top 25. Meaning the following game against Nebraska was a crucial game because they were ranked 14 in the polls. Entering the game against the Cornhuskers, the Buckeyes knew exactly what they had to do, and they scored and they did their job, using a lot of rushing attack by getting over 200 yards on the ground, including 91 from Braxton Miller. And their passing game, they only threw 18 passes all game, 8 from Miller and 10 from Boserman, with Boserman only completing 1 of those 10 passes. They ended up scoring a grand total of 27 points heading into the third quarter, and they were as far as 27-6 over the 14 ranked Cornhuskers, but somehow, some way, this is when everyone realized that their all-time coach from the year before was not here. Interim coach Luke Fickell, something happened to the defense because they absolutely choked this game away, allowing Nebraska to score a bunch of unanswered points. And by the time Rex Burkhead decided to run over all of them for that final touchdown in the end of the game, Nebraska had completed the biggest comeback in school history at the time, and that made Ohio State lose the game 34 to 27 to fall to a dismal 3-3 record, and they still hadn't won a single game in their conference yet. Despite Luke Fickell's team being a run-based offense and being kind of mid all around with not really too many big name players, they were able to stave off Illinois in another ugly contest, winning 17-7 before going to ranked Wisconsin. This is their third straight game they were going to play against a ranked team, as Illinois was 16, Wisconsin was ranked number 12. This is going to be the most difficult game they've had yet. But Braxton Miller initiated some sort of hope, a miracle for Ohio State, as they were able to stay with them, and he was able to get a Hail Mary pass complete for the win at the end of the fourth quarter.
Gifting going on. They get set. A half minute to play in the fourth quarter. Miller flushed. Wants to throw. Now he's going to do what he can with his legs. No, he will throw. Lobs it to the end zone. Touchdown. Devin Smith.
After that miracle win against Wisconsin, they still did not get a ranking in the top 25 polls because the Big Ten that year was extremely strong. Michigan State and Michigan were battling for the top spot, with Nebraska not too far behind, while Iowa and Northwestern were seemingly performing better than Ohio State. In the following game against the worst team in the Big Ten, Indiana, who would eventually go 1-11, they would beat them handily 34-20. And it would go on to be another conference game against Purdue that Luke Fickell's team would eventually fall flat on their face and essentially prove to everybody that this was not the team, the Ohio State Buckeyes team in years past. Against unranked Purdue, Braxton Miller couldn't even get more than 45% pass completion percentage, and they still lost in overtime 26-23, and this all but guaranteed that Ohio State was going to finish unranked, as they were just had 6 wins and were barely bowl eligible. And against number 21 Penn State, although their defense was able to shut out the Nittany Lions in the second half, they still lost 20-14 because Braxton Miller wasn't helping out at all. This was due to, even though their ground game was all right, they were still committing tons of turnovers on the ground, and Braxton Miller failing to post better pass completion percentages than 50. Their attack through the air was abysmal, and their ground game was okay, but their turnovers were too much, and it was basically guaranteed that the Buckeyes were done, as they already were 6-5 after that game against Penn State and were still unranked. But the season wouldn't be a total loss because their final game was the final game of the regular season against their biggest rival in Michigan, who was ranked 12. Could they go down to Ann Arbor and put a little bit of an upset, because maybe this season wouldn't be a total failure, because it was already looking like Luke Fickell was out the door after this abysmal season. We all know anything could happen in rivalry games, and that's exactly what happened. Braxton Miller went 14 for 25 for 235 yards, although his pass completion percentage was still barely above 55. He scored 2 touchdowns and stayed with Michigan in this crazy scoring shootout between their main rival. It was back and forth, back and forth. And when Michigan got a touchdown to put him up at 43, the touchdown was actually negated, and they ended up scoring a field goal, making it 40-34. Ohio State barely got a fourth down completion, but in the end, it was just too much for Braxton Miller, as although he had 100 yards rushing on the ground, it wasn't enough, as he ended up throwing a pick to end the game at the end of the fourth quarter to make Michigan win that game, their big rivalry game, and force the Buckeyes down to a dismal 6-6 record. It was already announced that at the conclusion of the 2011 season, Luke Fickell would be out as head coach, and Urban Meyer, who had led the Florida Gators to 2 national championships in 2006 and 2008, would become their head coach for the 2012 season. And they were going against the Florida Gators in the Gator Bowl for their postseason matchup, basically. There was a lot of hype for Urban Meyer, but could the Buckeyes end this abysmal season on a high by winning against Florida? They would not. Braxton Miller, although he had a decent game with 162 yards passing on 18 pass completions and 23 attempts with 2 touchdowns, the rushing game was mid, if you ask me. But Florida was able to best them just barely. But the problem was OSU just couldn't hold them back, even allowing a 99-yard kickoff return for the Gators to score, and Florida would go on to kick a game-clinching field goal with under a minute to go to win 24-17 to make the Ohio State Buckeyes end with a dismal 6-7 records. And it was the first time that the Buckeyes finished with a losing record since 1988, where back then there were less games and they finished that year with a 4-6-1 record. Ohio State ended their year 3-5 in Big Ten conference games and were only ahead of Illinois and Indiana in the final polls in the Big Ten conference, while they were also behind Purdue, Penn State, and Wisconsin in the leaders division of the Big Ten that year. The only player that got lots of recognition that year was John Simon, who received first team honors as a D lineman on the 2011 All Big Ten football team that year. Braxton Miller had a decent year, barely getting over 1,000 passing yards with a 54.1% completion percentage, but he got 715 yards rushing with 4.5 yards per carry. So, I mean, his passing was pretty mediocre, but his rushing at least was good. The Buckeyes gained an average of nearly 200 rushing yards and 127 passing yards per game. Between both Braxton Miller and Joe Boserman combined, they only threw 5 interceptions all season. Carlos Hyde ran for 566 yards on the ground for a grand total of 6 touchdowns. And the wide receiving core was pretty mediocre. The receiver that had the most receiving yards on the year was Devin Smith with 294 receiving yards. Damn. Overall, this season was a big failure. 6-7 after going basically undefeated the previous year at 12-1, but of course, we all know what happened because of the scandal. And could this team bounce back for the 2012 year after the abysmal year known as 2011? They actually would, with Urban Meyer taking over as head coach for the 2012 season and Fickell getting put back as the defensive coordinator. The team went undefeated, as Braxton Miller was named the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year with a big uptick in performance, as they easily won the leaders division handily over every other team there. But again, remember from the scandal from 2010, the Buckeyes were unable to play. They were not allowed to play in the postseason that year, so they were not eligible for the Big Ten Conference Championship, and they didn't even get to play in a bowl game because of that. The following year in 2013, they went 12-2, being undefeated against Big Ten players. Braxton Miller won Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year again. Carlos Hyde became the Big Ten Running Back of the Year. But then, the 2014 season, they were finally able to put it back on top. Unfortunately, this is coming from someone that really does not like the Buckeyes. This is why I loved making the 2011 Buckeyes video. Urban Meyer took them to a 14-1 record, and they won their first national championship since 2002 against my Oregon Ducks. Okay, yes, now I have a right to hate this team. This was the first year also that the college football playoffs existed, so the Buckeyes were the first championship in the college football playoff national championship game era. They were continuously successful for many years to come after that, and although they wouldn't win another national championship until the 2024 season, they were able to get right back on their feet following the hideous scandal from the 2010 season and their abysmal season in 2011. So while in 2011 the old guard in every single sport seemed to dominate in every division of American sports, with the Bruins in hockey, Tony Stewart in the NASCAR Cup Series, the Giants in the Super Bowl, and the Mavericks in the NBA, in college football, as household name Alabama went on to win the national championship that year, another main household name in the Ohio State Buckeyes had the worst season in the program's history, going a dismal 6-7 and is currently the last season that they went with a losing record, and the only one they've had since 1988. The Ohio State Buckeyes did not keep up with the old guard trend of the 2011 year and had the worst year of the program's existence. I hope you guys liked that video. Please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.